The courtroom was silent, yet charged with the heavy air of judgment. Sunlight filtered through tall, dusty windows, casting long shadows across polished wood and stern faces. Every eye in the room was fixed on a single figure, an unlikely defender, who looked far too small for the weight of the moment. She was just a girl. Her voice trembled as she rose from her chair, clutching a stack of notes that shook in her hands. Across the aisle, the prosecution smirked, already confident of victory, and at the bench, the judge leaned back, lips curled in amusement, as though this entire proceeding were nothing but a comedy at her expense. "Your Honor," the girl began, forcing the words past her fear, "I request permission to speak on behalf of my father." The room erupted in muffled laughter. Lawyers snickered. A few spectators exchanged whispers, shaking their heads at what they saw as a foolish display. The judge raised a brow, his tone dripping with condescension. He asked, drawing out the word as though it were a joke, "You think you're qualified to stand here and argue law in my courtroom?" The girl swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward her father seated at the defendant's table. His shoulders sagged, his face weary from months of accusations and hearings. But when their eyes met, he gave her the faintest nod. A fragile thread of courage passed from father to daughter. She stood taller. "Yes, Your Honor, I may not be a lawyer, but I know the truth, and I know the law should defend the innocent." The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "The law," he sneered, "is not a fairy tale for children. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." Gasps scattered through the room. Yet she didn't move. Her knuckles tightened around her papers, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The sting of mockery burned her, but something deeper burned brighter defiance. The prosecutor rose, smiling cruelly. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Shall we allow schoolchildren to argue our cases now? What's next? Story time instead of trial." His words drew laughter from the gallery, the sound echoing like a cruel chorus. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she steadied her breath and spoke again, louder this time, so every sneer and every smirk had to stop and listen. "If truth is unwelcome in this room," she declared, "then maybe it isn't a courtroom at all. Maybe it's just a stage for those who already decided the ending." The laughter faltered. The judge's smirk hardened into a scowl. He leaned forward, his gavel tapping once against the bench, sharp as a gunshot. "Watch your tongue, young lady," he warned. "This is not a place for speeches." But her words had already rippled through the silence. Spectators who had mocked her moments before now leaned forward, curious. Even the court stenographer paused, fingers hovering, eyes fixed on the girl who refused to sit down. She glanced again at her father. He looked torn, part pride, part fear that she was digging a hole they could never climb out of. Still, she pressed on. "My father doesn't have the money for expensive lawyers. He doesn't have friends in high places. But he has me, and I will not let you laugh at him while I stay silent." The judge exhaled heavily, tapping his pen against the bench. "Do you even know what you're doing?" Her answer was quiet but unwavering. "I know enough." A hushed tension blanketed the room. Somewhere in the back, a voice whispered, "She's braver than half the lawyers here." It was barely audible, but it carried, and the shift was undeniable. The prosecutor scoffed, breaking the moment. "This is a circus," he muttered, slamming his folder shut. "Let the record show that this child is wasting the court's time." But as the laughter died down, and as the girl held her ground, the room no longer seemed to find her funny. For the first time, they began to wonder what if she actually had something to say. The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Very well," he said at last, each word heavy with irritation. "If you insist on embarrassing yourself, the court will humor you for now. But don't mistake this for leniency. You'll learn quickly that the law is merciless." His gavel struck again. The sound echoed through the chamber like a warning. The girl sat down slowly, her hands still trembling, but a spark flickered in her eyes. She had been mocked, ridiculed, and nearly silenced, yet she had survived her first stand in the lion's den. What the judge and the lawyers didn't know was that this was only the beginning. And as she looked down at her note-scribbled lines of statutes, hidden truths buried in the case files, she whispered to herself, almost like a vow, "They'll laugh today, but tomorrow, they'll listen." The camera of our story lingers on that spark in her eyes, before pulling back across the tense courtroom, where doubt and curiosity now mix in the air. The judge thinks he has won this round, but what he doesn't know is that his laughter has awakened a fighter who will not back down. Long before the laughter of that courtroom, there was another sound that echoed in her memory, the steady voice of her father. It was a voice that carried both strength and weariness, a voice that told stories not from books, but from the lessons of survival. She remembered being no more than 7 years old, sitting at the edge of a worn kitchen table, its surface scarred from years of hard use. Her father, hands rough from long shifts, leaned forward with a serious look in his eyes. "Baby girl," he said, "life won't always be fair. People won't always treat you right. But you got to remember, this truth will stand, even when the world tries to push it down." At that moment, she didn't fully understand what he meant, but she saw the fire in his eyes, a fire that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hard the world tried. That fire would live in her too. The flashback shifted another memory. Rain hammered against the roof as she lay awake at night. Through the thin walls, she heard her father pacing, worrying about bills, food, and keeping the lights on. Yet, every morning he woke her with a smile, packing her lunch with hands that shook from exhaustion. "Don't worry about me," he would whisper when she asked why he looked so tired. "Just focus on your dreams. I'll carry the rest." But she never forgot those nights. The weight he carried was a burden that shaped her resolve. Years passed, and with them came sacrifice after sacrifice. While other fathers bought their children gifts, her father gave her something rarer: his time, his wisdom, his unshakable belief that she could be more than the world expected. When schoolmates laughed at her for being poor, he would kneel down, look her in the eyes, and say, "They can laugh at what you wear, but they can't laugh at your strength." It was in those moments she began to understand resilience, not as a word in a book, but as a way of survival. One memory burned brighter than the rest. She was 10, clutching her report card in trembling hands. Her grades weren't perfect, and she braced for disappointment, but her father only smiled. "Did you give it your best?" he asked gently. "Yes," she whispered. "Then that's all I'll ever ask of you. Never be ashamed of trying." That night, she overheard him on the porch, speaking quietly to a neighbor. "I can't give her much," he admitted, "but I'll make sure she knows her worth." Those words sank deep into her heart. She vowed then that no matter what happened, she would never let her father down. Back in the present, as she sat in that cold courtroom, those memories wrapped around her like armor. The judge's laughter still stung, but it could not erase the years of her father's sacrifices. Every insult, every mocking smile, none of it compared to the strength she had inherited from the man at her side. She could almost hear his voice again, steady and unwavering. "Truth will stand." And so she whispered to herself, too softly for anyone else to hear, "I will not fail you, Dad, not here, not ever." Her vow wasn't spoken for the courtroom. It wasn't for the judge or the lawyers. It was a promise carved into her very soul, a promise that she would carry forward, no matter the cost. Little did anyone in that room know, the vow of a daughter was about to become the weapon that would turn the tide of the entire case. And as the gavel prepared to strike again, her heart was already steady, ready for the battles ahead. Because this wasn't just about a trial anymore. It was about honoring a father's sacrifices with a daughter's unbreakable courage. The next morning, the girl walked back into the courthouse with her father. The wooden doors creaked shut behind them like the closing gates of a fortress designed to keep people like them out. From the outside, the building stood tall, a monument of justice carved in stone. But inside, the truth felt different. Cold marble floors, polished pews, stern portraits of judges past. It was less a place of fairness and more a theater, where power was the script and ordinary people were nothing more than props. As the trial resumed, the girl began to see the pattern. The judge's gavel came down quicker whenever she tried to speak. The prosecution was allowed wide, leeway interruptions, objections, even sneers, but every time she raised her voice, the judge narrowed his eyes, as if daring her to cross a line. The deck was stacked, and it was stacked high. "Your Honor," she said carefully, "I'd like to call attention to overruled." The judge snapped before she even finished. "Stick to relevant matters." She bit her lip. Relevant. The truth was relevant, but in this room, it seemed truth didn't matter. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, smiling like a man who knew the game was rigged in his favor. "You see, miss," he drawled mockingly, "there are rules to this. Rules you clearly don't understand." The gallery chuckled again. It was déjà vu, the same laughter that had mocked her before. But this time she saw it differently. This wasn't about her lack of experience. This was about a system designed to make sure her father never stood a chance. Her father reached across the table, placing a trembling hand over hers. "It's all right," he whispered. Maybe this is just how it ends." But she shook her head firmly. No, she refused to believe that justice was only for those who could afford it. As witnesses were called, her frustration deepened. The prosecution's witnesses spoke rehearsed lines, their words polished, their lies neatly tucked between practiced pauses. She tried to cross-examine, but each time she pressed too close, the judge cut her off. "Objection sustained. Move along. Don't badger the witness." It was a slow suffocation, a chokehold of legal procedure used not to protect truth, but to bury it. At one point, a key document was introduced to evidence she suspected was flawed. She rose, ready to challenge it, but the judge waved her down. "Accepted into record," he declared. "But, Your Honor, enough." The gavel struck. "You're out of your depth, young lady. Learn when to be silent." The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder, and for a moment, the girl felt crushed beneath its weight. Every path she tried to take was blocked. Every attempt to fight back smothered before it could breathe. The truth was clear. This wasn't a trial. It was an execution dressed up in robes and rituals. And yet, something stirred inside her. The more they tried to silence her, the stronger her resolve grew. If they wanted her quiet, it was because they feared her voice. If they wanted her out, it was because they knew she had the courage to keep pushing. She leaned close to her father, whispering so only he could hear. "Don't give up on me, not yet." He looked at her, eyes tired, but searching, and, after a long pause, he nodded. The session dragged on. Every detail screamed of corruption. A prosecutor too comfortable, a judge too smug, an entire system tilted toward a single outcome. But instead of breaking her, the realization hardened her spirit. By the time the day ended, and the court adjourned, she walked out of the heavy doors with a different look in her eyes. The odds were impossible. Yes, but impossible didn't mean unwinnable. Because she had seen through the mask, this courtroom wasn't invincible. It was flawed, biased, human, and where there are flaws, there are cracks. Cracks she intended to find. As she stepped into the fading sunlight, she whispered again, the vow she had made in her heart since childhood, "I will not let him fall." And though the stacked decks seemed unbeatable, the story was only just beginning. The courtroom had shown her just how hopeless the odds were. But as the gavel echoed in her memory, something inside her shifted. She could either accept defeat or arm herself with the only weapon they could never take from her, knowledge. That night, while the rest of the city slept, she sat hunched over a dim desk lamp. Papers scattered around her like fallen leaves, case files, transcripts, and thick books with titles that seemed carved in another language. The library had become her second home, its silence broken only by the scratching of her pen and the rustle of turning pages. At first, the words made no sense. Statute, precedent, burden of proof. They were a maze of jargon meant to keep people like her out. But the more she read, the clearer it became. Laws weren't magic. They were patterns, rules built on language. And language, if read carefully, could be bent, reshaped, even turned against those who wielded it. Her father watched from the doorway one evening, his tired frame leaning against the wall. "You don't have to do this, baby," he whispered. "This is too big for you." She didn't even look up from her notes. "No, Dad, it's too big to walk away from." His silence said everything: fear, pride, and love tangled together. He left her to her books, though she could hear him lingering just outside the door, as if standing guard. Hours bled into days, days into weeks. She studied until her eyes burned and her hands cramped. She copied down arguments from past trials, underlined passages from law journals, and pieced together fragments of truth that no one else bothered to see. Each breakthrough felt like fire catching in dry wood. One night, as the rain pounded the windows, she stumbled across a dusty volume of appellate cases. Buried within was a ruling eerily similar to her father's situation. She read it once, then again, her lips parted as the realization sank in. There was a precedent, a legal crack in the wall that the prosecution had ignored. She slammed her pen down, heart racing. "They think we're powerless," she whispered to herself. "But they're wrong. They missed this. I won't." Her notebook filled with diagrams of arguments, arrows connecting statutes to precedents, strategies mapped like battle plans. Slowly, what began as desperation grew into determination, and as she worked, she began to see the truth. The system wasn't invincible. It wasn't even perfect. It was flawed, messy, human, and those flaws were opportunities. The more she uncovered, the more her confidence grew. She noticed inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence. She spotted procedural mistakes, small but significant. She learned how objections worked, how to phrase questions that demanded answers, and how to weave truth into language so even the judge couldn't dismiss it. But the price was heavy. Sleep became rare. Meals were skipped. Her hands trembled from exhaustion. Still, she pressed on, whispering her father's words each time her strength wavered. "Truth will stand." One evening, after weeks of relentless study, she fell asleep on a pile of papers. Her father gently placed a blanket over her shoulders. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the daughter who refused to give up on him. His voice cracked as he whispered into the quiet, "You're stronger than I ever was." By the time the trial was set to resume, she was no longer the same trembling girl who had first faced the judge's mockery. She was armed not with a lawyer's degree, but with something more dangerous, knowledge sharpened by love, fueled by defiance. And as she packed her notes into a worn folder, her eyes hardened with resolve. The courtroom had laughed at her once, but the next time she stood to speak, she wouldn't just be a daughter defending her father. She would be a fighter wielding the law itself. The night ended with a whisper that carried into the dark, a promise more powerful than any gavel. "Tomorrow, they'll see me differently." The prison visiting room was silent except for the faint buzz of flickering lights. She sat across the cold metal table, clutching her notebook like a lifeline. Her father, shackled and tired, lowered his head. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't angry. They were heavy with something worse. "Defeat, baby girl," he whispered, his voice barely rising above the hum of the room. "You gotta stop this. You're fighting a war you can't win. I can't let you ruin your life for me." Her throat tightened. She had prepared for cross-examinations, loopholes, and motions. But not this. Not the one thing she feared most, her father giving up on himself. "I'm not ruining my life," she replied firmly, though her hands trembled under the table. "I'm saving yours." He shook his head slowly. Years of hard labor and injustice had carved lines across his face. His shoulders sagged under invisible chains, heavier than the ones on his wrists. They already decided my fate the day I walked in that courtroom. You saw it, the smirks, the judge laughing when you spoke. That's not a trial, it's a performance. And the ending's already written. His words cut deeper than any gavel's strike. She wanted to argue, but his voice, low, tired, and laced with love, held her still. I need you to live free, to chase dreams that aren't chained to me. I can survive in here, but I can't watch them break you. Her eyes burned, but she refused to blink. She leaned forward, whispering back with a fire he thought he had lost forever. They laughed at me. Yes, they underestimated me. But that's exactly why I'm going to win. Not because I'm stronger than them, but because they'll never see me coming. For the first time in weeks, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. Pride, mixed with fear in his expression. He wanted to believe her, but he was terrified of what belief would cost. Promise me, he said softly, that if it gets too heavy, you'll walk away. Promise me you won't let this destroy you. She hesitated. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Finally, she took his chained hands in hers and held them tight. I promise. I'll fight smart. I won't let them destroy me, but I will never walk away. The guards moved closer, signaling the visit was over. As they pulled him to his feet, her father turned back one last time. His voice cracked, but his words carried across the room. You remind me of your mama. She never backed down, either. And then he was gone, swallowed by steel doors and silence. She sat alone at the table, heart racing, notebook pressed to her chest. His plea hadn't broken her. It had carved her resolve in stone. If the system was a stage, then she would rewrite the script. If the verdict was already written, she would tear it apart and write her own ending. And as she rose from that chair, one thought echoed louder than all the doubts. They thought this fight was over, but it was only just beginning. The courtroom was colder than ever, not because of the air, but because of the stares. Rows of eyes followed her as she rose from the defense table, a teenager standing where trained lawyers should be. Her notebook trembled slightly in her hands, but her voice steady, clear, broke through the silence. Your Honor, before this court condemns my father, I'd like to present evidence that has not yet been fairly considered. The judge leaned back in his chair, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. He tapped his gavel once, almost mockingly, as the prosecutor smirked. Oh, the young lady thinks she's an attorney now. His tone dripped with sarcasm. Proceed, but don't waste the court's time. We all know how this ends. Laughter rippled through the room. The same laughter she had heard before. But this time, it didn't pierce her, it fueled her. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and spoke louder. With respect, Your Honor, this court exists to pursue justice, not to script foregone conclusions. And according to Article 14 of the State Criminal Code, justice requires that evidence be weighed fully and fairly. I will show you where this case has ignored that duty. The room shifted. A hush spread. The mocking smiles faltered. The girl had just quoted the law word for word. The prosecutor rose, his voice sharp. Objection, Your Honor. She's not a licensed attorney. She has no standing. But before the gavel could slam, she cut in. Calmly, actually, under Section 21B, defendants are allowed to represent themselves or be represented by someone they authorize. My father authorized me. That is his constitutional right. Gasps scattered across the benches. The judge's smirk faded, replaced with the faintest flicker of annoyance. He leaned forward now, narrowing his eyes. So, you've been reading law books, H. Fine, let's hear this. Argument. Her hands shook under the table, but her words didn't falter. She flipped open her notebook, every page filled with cramped handwriting, highlighted statutes, and references. On page 7 of the evidence file, she began. The prosecution claims the fingerprints on the tool were conclusive, but they omitted the fact that the prints were partial, so partial, in fact, that the forensic examiner wrote in her notes, quote, identification inconclusive. That note was buried, not submitted in open court. Murmurs rippled. Heads turned toward the prosecution's table. The lead attorney stiffened, his jaw tightening. The judge's gaze flickered between her and the papers before him. His voice, for once, held no laughter. Do you have proof of this omission? She held up the copy, her fingers steady now. Right here, Your Honor, page 34, line 12. Silence. The kind of silence that bends the air itself. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing at her. They were listening. The prosecutor lunged forward, his voice sharp with desperation. This is outrageous. She's cherry-picking notes. This is irrelevant to the larger case, but the judge raised his hand. Enough, the young lady has cited the law correctly, and her observation will be noted in the record. The girl lowered her notebook slowly, her breath catching in her chest. She had done it. Her first strike, her first clash. Her father looked at her from behind the bars of the holding cell, pride glowing through the exhaustion in his eyes. For the first time in weeks. He sat up straighter, but the battle was far from over. The judge cleared his throat, his voice returning to its sharp edge. Very well, you've earned the right to be heard, but be warned, young lady, this court is not a playground. If you stumble, your father pays the price. She met his gaze, fire in her voice. Then I won't stumble. The gallery leaned forward. The tide had shifted. The little girl the courtroom had mocked now stood as a force they could not dismiss, and though the first clash was over, the war for justice had only just begun. The hush that had fallen over the courtroom after her first victory lingered like a storm cloud. Everyone leaned forward, waiting, curious, cautious, almost afraid of what this girl might say next. She stood at the center of the storm, her notebook pressed to her chest, eyes sharp, voice steady. "Your Honor," she began, "the prosecution's case rests on shaky ground, and today, I will show you just how weak it really is." The prosecutor let out a scoff. "This is ridiculous. She's a child. We can't keep indulging this circus act." But the judge raised a finger, his tone clipped. "She has earned the right to speak. Sit down, counselor." The tension snapped tighter. For the first time, the gavel favored her. She stepped toward the witness stand, where the first Manistore clerk shifted uncomfortably. He had testified earlier that he saw her father near the scene of the alleged crime. "Sir," she said, voiced calm but cutting, "you told this court that you saw my father at the store at 9:15 p.m., correct?" "Yes," the man stammered. "That's what I said." She opened her notebook, flipping to a page with highlighted lines. "But according to your own written statement to the police, you said 10:30 p.m. Which one is it? 9:15 or 10:30? The man froze. His eyes darted toward the prosecutor. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The gallery stirred. Murmurs rose like a tide. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection. She's misreading the but," she cut him off, her voice sharp. "The statement is signed and dated by this witness. The times don't match. Either he misremembered then, or he's misremembering now. Which is it, sir?" The clerk swallowed hard, sweat forming on his brow. "I must have mixed it up. I'm not sure anymore." Gasps erupted. The first crack in the prosecution's case had split wide open. Her eyes flicked toward her father, and she caught the faintest spark of hope in his tired face. That was enough to keep her going. Next came the officer who had handled the arrest. He spoke confidently, his badge gleaming, his tone filled with authority. "We detained the suspect because he matched the description. It was a lawful arrest." She stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "And that description, could you read it for the court?" The officer hesitated. "Medium build, dark jacket, dark pants. That's it." She pressed. "No height, no identifying marks, nothing that distinguishes one man from another." The officer bristled. "It was the description we had." She nodded slowly, then held up a copy of the report. "But this is interesting, because here on page 2 you wrote that the man had a limp. My father has never walked with a limp. So again, are you sure the man you arrested fit the description?" The officer's jaw tightened. His silence was louder than words. The gallery whispered louder now, the hum of doubt spreading through the room. And then came the final blow. A key witness, a woman who swore she saw her father committing the crime. "You testified that you saw my father clearly under the streetlight," the girl said. "Yes." The woman replied confidently. "Then, tell me," she asked, leaning in, "was it the north streetlight, or the south one?" The woman blinked. "The north, I think." The girl's lips curved into the smallest, sharpest smile. "There was no north streetlight. That one has been broken for months. City maintenance reports confirm it." "So, where exactly did you see him?" The woman froze. The color drained from her face. The spectators erupted, voices buzzing with disbelief. The courtroom was alive now, not with laughter, but with doubt. The mighty case against her father was starting to crumble. The prosecutor leaped to his feet again, red-faced. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." She's twisting words, confusing witnesses, but the judge's gavel cracked down hard. "Order, order in this courtroom." He turned his eyes on the girl, studying her like he was seeing her for the first time. She stood tall, her voice unwavering. "I'm not twisting anything, Your Honor. I'm exposing the lies." One by one, the silence that followed was electric. Every victory was small, but together, they built something bigger, a momentum no one could deny. The people in the benches leaned in closer, whispering about the girl who was doing what seasoned lawyers COULDN, single quotes TOULDN, single quotes T. Her father sat straighter, his hands gripping the rail of the holding cell, tears welling in his eyes. He had come to court, ready to be broken, but now, he was daring to hope. The prosecutor, once smug, now shuffled his papers nervously. Witness after witness had faltered under her steady questions, and though the battle wasn't over, the tide had turned. The judge finally leaned forward, his voice quieter, heavier. "This court has never seen anything like this before." And with that, the gavel fell. A pause, a breath. The first act of her fight was complete, but in the shadows of the courthouse, bigger battles were waiting. More powerful enemies were yet to show their hands. She had exposed the lies. Now, she had to survive what came next. The silence after her revelation was almost unbearable. The courtroom, once so smug and certain, now felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. The girl had placed undeniable truth on the table, and everyone could see it. But not everyone could accept it. The judge's hand trembled slightly as he set the paper down. His face flushed, his pride bruised in front of the very people who once trusted his authority. And then, he snapped. Enough. His gavel slammed against the wood, echoing like thunder. This is not a stage for theatrics. This is a court of law. The girl didn't move. She stood steady, her hands at her sides, her folder of documents pressed tightly against her chest. Your Honor, she said quietly but firmly, I only brought the evidence this court should have considered from the beginning. The judge's eyes narrowed. You dare lecture me? A child, pretending to play lawyer. You insult the very dignity of this courtroom. The gallery stirred. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. They had seen arrogance before, but this was different. This was venom. The prosecutor, eager to regain ground, smirked and whispered something into his colleague's ear. But the whispers were drowned out by the tension building in the room. Everyone could see it. The judge wasn't just angry. He was threatened. You think this stunt, the judge barked, proves anything? Documents can be forged. Photographs can be altered. And you, he jabbed a finger in her direction, are unqualified to speak in this chamber. The girl's father started to rise, but she touched his arm, stopping him. She met the judge's fury with calm resolve. I may not wear a robe, she said, her voice carrying now, but truth doesn't need one. Gasps, murmurs. The gavel slammed again, harder this time. The judge's face twisted. He wanted to silence her, to bury her words under noise and intimidation. But the more he lashed out, the clearer it became. This wasn't justice. This was bias or order. The judge roared. But the gallery wasn't silent anymore. A voice from the back called, she's right. Another added, let her speak. Soon the chamber was buzzing, filled with whispers of doubt about the fairness of the bench itself. The girl stood taller, but inside, her heart raced. She had cracked the case. Yes, but she had also exposed something much darker. The very man meant to uphold. Justice was desperate to suppress it. The judge leaned forward, his tone dropping into a venomous growl. If you continue this charade, I will hold you in contempt. Her father rose this time, unable to stay seated. Contempt, he thundered. The only contempt in this room is coming from that bench. The word struck like lightning. The courtroom gasped again. Never had anyone dared speak to a judge that way. The judge's face burned red. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash his wrath on them both. But then he hesitated, because he could feel it. Dozens of eyes drilling into him, watching, measuring, questioning, every slam of his gavel. Every insult he hurled, every attempt to diminish that young girl, it all made his bias more undeniable. The people were beginning to see. The girl didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Instead, she lowered her voice, making the entire courtroom lean in to hear her. You can try to silence me, Your Honor. You can try to intimidate us. But truth doesn't vanish because you shout at it. The room was electric. The judge, for the first time, faltered. His gavel hung in the air, but didn't strike. His eyes darted across the gallery. Faces he once commanded with ease now stared back at him with suspicion. The girl's words hung heavy, impossible to erase. The evidence was out, the cracks in his authority visible to everyone. And with every second that passed, his mask of control slipped further away. But she knew this wasn't over. He wouldn't surrender quietly. His wrath was dangerous, and if cornered, he might strike harder than ever before. Still, something had shifted. The people weren't blind anymore. They had seen the truth, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. As the judge sat back, fists clenched and jaw tight, the girl braced herself. The battle was entering a new stage, and the next move would decide whether justice survived or whether corruption would lash out one last time. The storm was far from over, and as she gathered her notes, she whispered to herself, the real test is coming next. It began with whispers inside the courtroom, but those whispers didn't stay confined within four walls. They spilled into the streets like wildfire. By nightfall, the story had spread across town. People who hadn't even stepped foot in the courthouse were talking about the girl who stood up to the judge. They spoke of how she exposed lies, how she held her ground against mockery, and how she reminded everyone what courage looked like. For some, it was just gossip. For others, it was a spark. At the corner store, an elderly woman whispered to a neighbor, "Did you hear about her? That little girl, defending her daddy?" The neighbor leaned closer, replying, "Not just defending him, defending all of us." Soon, barbershops buzzed with heated debates. Church groups lifted her and her father in prayer. And outside the courthouse, small clusters of people gathered, waiting to see what would happen next. The community, once divided and doubtful, began to realize this case wasn't just about one man accused. It was about something larger: dignity, fairness, and a system that too often crushed the powerless. The girl felt it before she saw it. Walking home one evening, she noticed people pausing to look her way. A nod here, a whispered blessing there. And then, one brave voice spoke up. "You keep fighting, child. We're with you." She turned, surprised, to see a shopkeeper standing in his doorway. Behind him, others nodded. Their eyes held something she hadn't seen before. Faith, her father, though weary from the strain of trial, smiled faintly. "See that?" he told her. "This isn't just our burden anymore. They see themselves in us." And he was right. The next morning, when the trial resumed, the gallery was packed tighter than ever before. People filled the benches, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching intently. Outside, a line formed down the courthouse steps. Reporters arrived with cameras and microphones, sensing a storm that was no longer just legal, but moral. The prosecutors shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tide turning. The judge's glare grew sharper, angrier, as though the growing crowd outside his courtroom was a direct threat to his control, and perhaps it was because when communities awaken, when people realize they've been silent too long, power begins to shift. The girl felt the weight of it pressing on her shoulders. But it wasn't the crushing pressure of isolation anymore. It was responsibility, yes, but also strength. The murmurs of support, the nods of encouragement, the quiet prayers, each one lifted her a little higher. Still, with every new ally came a new risk. The louder their story grew, the more dangerous it became. Those threatened by change would not stand quietly. She knew it, her father knew it, and the community knew it too. But once a people tastes courage, once they see the possibility of truth breaking chains, there's no turning back. By the end of that day, her fight was no longer just for her father's freedom. It had become something far bigger: justice for everyone who had ever been silenced, mocked, or dismissed. And as the courthouse emptied and the girl looked out upon the crowd waiting in the streets, she understood. This was no longer their private battle. It was a movement. The battle lines were clearer now than ever before. And the next step would test not just her voice, but the strength of everyone standing behind her. The courtroom fell silent as she rose to her feet. Every eye turned toward her, but for the first time, the weight of their gaze didn't make her shrink. It fueled her. She could feel the pulse of the community behind her. The prayers whispered in the pews, the murmurs outside these walls, all of it building to this moment. This wasn't just another hearing. This was the moment. She took a deep breath, her notes trembling in her hands. Then she set them down deliberately, her voice steady as she began. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, I am not a lawyer. I don't wear a robe, I don't carry a degree. But what I do carry is truth. The judge scoffed, shifting in his chair, but this time he didn't interrupt. Something in the room demanded he listen. She walked toward the jury box, her steps slow, deliberate. From the beginning, my father has been painted as guilty. The prosecution stacked words and assumptions, hoping you wouldn't notice the cracks. But I noticed, and I want you to notice too. She lifted a piece of paper and overlooked record, introduced earlier but buried beneath the noise. This, she said firmly, is proof the timeline never added up. They wanted you to ignore it, but ignoring the truth doesn't erase it. The courtroom leaned in. Even the clerk stopped writing for a moment. She pressed on, weaving evidence with human dignity. You've been told my father is nothing but a number in a file, but he's more than that. He's a man who worked 2 jobs to keep food on our table. He's a neighbor who fixes broken fences without being asked. He's the reason I believe in fairness, because he lived it, even when the world didn't return it. Her father's eyes glistened as he sat at the defense table. He wanted to speak, to protest her taking this burden, but pride held him silent. Turning back to the judge, she locked eyes with him. You laughed at me once, Your Honor. You told me this wasn't my place. But if defending truth, if standing up for justice, if fighting for the dignity of the man who raised MIF, that's not my place, then whose place is it? Gasps rippled through the gallery. The words struck harder than any piece of evidence. She didn't stop there. She pivoted to the jury, voice strong, unwavering now. The law was written to protect the innocent, not to destroy them. And yes, I'm young. Yes, I'm inexperienced. But the law is not supposed to belong only to the powerful. It belongs to all of us. And today, I'm asking you to remember that. Her hand trembled as she set the papers down again, but her voice never broke. Do not let bias blind you. Do not let corruption decide for you. Look at the evidence, look at the truth, and you will see what I see. An innocent man. Silence blanketed the room. Even the judge leaned back, his face tight, realizing the shift in atmosphere. In that moment, the girl stood taller than the walls around her. She was no longer just a daughter defending her father. She was the voice of every person who had ever been silenced, every soul who had ever been told to know their place. Her words didn't just hang in the air, they carved themselves into the hearts of everyone present. And when she finally stepped back, the hush that followed wasn't emptiness. It was weight, the weight of truth no longer hidden, the weight of justice demanding to be heard. The judge cleared his throat, visibly unsettled. But it no longer mattered, because the room had already shifted. The gallery saw it, the jury felt it. Even the walls of the courtroom seemed to tremble with the power of her words. This was her defining moment. And as she returned to her seat beside her father, his hand gripping hers with a strength she hadn't felt in weeks, she knew the battle wasn't finished yet, but for the first time, victory felt within reach. The next chapter would decide everything. The air inside the courtroom was heavy, almost suffocating. Every bench was filled, every aisle crowded, and yet no one dared to move. It was as if the very building itself was holding its breath, waiting. The girl sat beside her father, her small hands clasped tightly together, His wrists, once weighed down by cold steel cuffs, now rested free on the polished wood of the defense table. But freedom wasn't his yet, not until the next few words left the judge's lips. The judge himself sat high upon the bench. His face hardened into that same mask of authority he had worn since the very first day. Only now, there was something different. The mocking smirk that once curled on his lips had vanished. In its place was a tension he could no longer conceal. For the first time, the gavel in his hand trembled. The clerk rose, voice steady but loud enough to carry across the chamber. "All rise." Everyone stood. Wooden chairs scraped against the floor like a chorus of nerves. The girl could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, louder than any voice in the room. She stole a glance at her father, his eyes closed, his lips moving silently in prayer. Then the words came. In the matter of the state versus the girl, gripped the edge of the table. The jury finds the defendant. A pause, 1 second. 2. The silence stretched, unbearable, until the final word broke it apart. Not guilty. The world shifted in that instant. Gasps filled the room. Some cried out in joy, others in shock. Her father's shoulders dropped as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his back. The girl covered her mouth, tears spilling freely, unable to contain the flood of relief. The courtroom erupted. Strangers embraced. Neighbors wept. Even the hardest faces in the gallery softened. For them, this verdict wasn't just about one man walking free. It was proof that truth could still pierce through the armor of power. But the greatest silence came from the bench. The judge sat frozen, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around the gavel. He had mocked her. He had laughed at the idea that a girl, barely grown, could stand toe-to-toe with him. Yet here he was, stripped of his authority by the very law he claimed to command. His eyes darted across the room, searching for control he no longer had. The girl, though trembling, stood. For the first time, she looked directly at him, not with fear, but with steady resolve. Their eyes locked, his filled with disbelief, hers with quiet fire. She didn't need to say a word. Her victory was written in the air around them, and the voices rising like thunder from the people who now knew her story. The father rose slowly, tears streaking his weathered face. He turned to his daughter, placing a hand over her trembling fingers. "You did it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You saved me." But she shook her head gently. "No, Daddy," she said softly. "We saved each other." Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The prosecutor sank into his chair, defeated, already knowing his name would forever be tied to this failure. And still the judge remained silent. For the first time, he had no power left. The law had spoken, not his twisted version of it, but the true kind, sharpened by courage and lit by truth. When the bailiff finally called for order, the crowd began to spill into the streets. Outside, cheers echoed down the courthouse steps. The same people who had once watched quietly now lifted their voices together. Inside, the girl lingered for a moment, taking it all in. She could feel the shift. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of fear, but of possibility. As her father embraced her, the girl glanced back one last time. The judge sat slumped in his chair, gavel limp in his hand. His authority shattered. And though this chapter was closing, she knew the fight wasn't over, because truth had won a battle today. But the war for justice was only just beginning, and tomorrow would demand even more. The courthouse doors opened, and sunlight spilled across the stone steps like a spotlight. Father and daughter walked out together, hand in hand, greeted by a roar of voices that echoed down the street. It wasn't just relief anymore, it was triumph. The crowd wasn't celebrating one man's freedom, they were celebrating proof that even the smallest voice could rattle the walls of power. The girl blinked against the brightness, her chest rising with every cheer. Only hours ago, she was mocked in that very courtroom. Now, she was lifted by the same community that had once sat silent, uncertain. A woman from the crowd pushed forward, clutching her child's hand. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, "You gave us hope. My daughter, she saw what you did today. She'll never forget it." The girl bent down, meeting the child's wide eyes. "Don't ever let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter," she said softly. "Not even a judge." The little girl smiled, and something in that moment felt eternal, like a torch being passed. One small flame sparking another. Her father, still trembling from the weight of freedom, looked around at the crowd, his voice rough but steady. "I stood accused, but today, I walk free, because my daughter believed the truth was stronger than fear." The crowd answered with thunderous applause. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed like lightning. But for the girl, the noise faded away. All she could feel was her father's hand tightening around hers, as though grounding her in a new reality. They walked together through the crowd, each step echoing louder than the judge's gavel ever could. Later that evening, the neighborhood gathered outside their home. Neighbors who had once stayed in the shadows now stood shoulder to shoulder, carrying food, music, and voices raised in unity. What was once a quiet street became alive with joy, a celebration not of victory alone but of justice. Long delayed, yet finally delivered. The girl sat with her father on the porch, watching children laugh as they played. The air smelled of home cooking and freedom. The kind of night that would be told and retold in generations. Her father's voice broke the stillness. "You know," he said gently, "I thought I was protecting you, but it was you who protected me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, eyes wet but shining. "You raised me to stand tall. Daddy, I just stood where you couldn't." He smiled through tears, and in that smile was pride, relief, and something greater, recognition of a legacy continuing through her. The community had seen her strength. They had seen a child defy authority, not with anger, but with truth. And now, she was no longer just a daughter defending her father. She was a symbol, proof that courage could outlive fear, and symbols live longer than stories. In the weeks that followed, whispers spread beyond the courthouse, beyond the city. Parents told their children about the girl who made a judge bow his head. Teachers spoke her name in classrooms, not as myth, but as example. She had become more than a girl who once trembled at a courtroom table. She was now part of something larger, a reminder that justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those brave enough to demand it. As the night deepened, she rose from the porch and looked out at the crowd. Lantern light flickered on proud faces. Laughter carried on the wind. For the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt endless, like her voice would echo long after the night had passed. She whispered to herself, "They'll never laugh at me again." And she was right, because laughter fades, but truth leaves a legacy. Then this was only the beginning.